Hi everyone, this is Professor G. First of all, I just want to say that I hope that everyone is doing well and is staying safe, despite everything, all of the chaos that is going on. And as always, keep this in mind going forward. If anything ever does come up as a question, or if you have something that you are concerned about, please always feel free to send me a message. You have the ability to send me text messages. There's information on Canvas. You can also message me directly through your Canvas inbox. That's fine too. Or you can send me an email, and that's at jason-sculia@berkeleycollege.edu, and all that information is on Canvas. So what I want to do in this video is I want to talk about fiction. I want to talk about why it's so important. One of the things that I truly believe is that the more time we spend really thinking about this, the smoother the rest of the semester goes, because studying fiction is super, super important. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to change my screen so that we can move forward with it. So I want to talk about why fiction is so important to think about. All right, so I want to start with something just very simple, right? And this is just the bare bones. This is just the essential piece of information, right? When we talk about fiction, we talk about something that is made up or imaginary, right? So characters may be fictional, right? They're created by the author. The situation or the entire world can be created by the author. So that's the simple thing to just keep in mind. But I want to make that a little bit more complicated, because fiction and how it functions is extraordinarily difficult. We'll be practicing how to break it apart and how to analyze it. So the first thing I want to say is that creating and reading fiction is essential to the human experience. It actually is something that makes us human. The fact that I can stand here and create a situation out of nowhere and just create characters that don't exist in the real world is part of being human. It's part of creativity. It's part of imagination, right? Fiction puts a focus on imagination over memory, right? So if you can think of a memoir, all right, for example, or any story where a person simply tells their own story, right, or tells about an historical event, for example, the focus there is on what the writer remembers, right, what they can recall from their past experiences. Now, with fiction, that's not the focus. The focus is on creating something new, creating something different, right? So it's on imagination, right? What the writer can create through imagining whatever they are trying to imagine. So when we think about fiction or writing fiction, we think about world building. All right, so if you are a fan of the video game Sims or SimCity, which is a little bit an older version, right? In Sims, you create a character, a person from scratch, and you have them interact with the world around them. You can create houses, you can create the environment. So that gives us a model for world building. Fiction does the same thing. When you sit down and your goal is to create a fictional world, you can choose what that world is going to be like. You can build that world from the bottom up, depending on the kind of fiction you want to create. Now, that's the writing part of fiction. The reading part is that when we read fiction, we are entering worlds, right? Someone else has created it for us for a particular reason. And as readers, and especially as critical readers, we need to be really responsible about what happens when we enter it, right? So thinking about how world building and world entering is essential to the fiction experience. All right, so I want to say more about this. This is really sort of weird, right? Worlds are governed by rules and guidelines, all right? So our world, the one that we inhabit in reality, is governed by principles like gravity, right? If I drop something, it falls. It doesn't fly off, right? And the world is also governed. Backtrack a little bit, by the laws of physics, right? There is very little I can do to push against them, right? So, and here, right, if I take a pen or anything and I drop it, it's going to simply fall down, hit the table, hit the ground, hit whatever is beneath it, right? So we have rules that govern our own existence. Now, what about fictional worlds? Same principle applies. When you have a fictional world, whether you are writing it or whether you are reading it, there are rules that are being created. So anyone entering that world should pay attention to those rules and how they operate. Now, when we're talking about a fictional story, sometimes the rules are very different from our own. Lord of the Rings, right? When we enter this world, we enter a world that is inhabited by hobbits and goblins and all these fictional creatures. Harry Potter, right, is a world that has magic, right? And muggles. Muggles are non-magical folks, so they don't experience magic, they don't see magic, they don't believe in magic. So it's this world that has its own rules for operating, right? Even though, for example, I cannot point this at something and make it move in the real world, in the world of Harry Potter, I can. I have that capability. Alright, so sometimes the rules are very different than our own. At other times, the rules are very similar, right? That even if the characters are different, or if the situation is different, the rules that apply are basically the same. So from a few years ago, they did a movie version of The Hate U Give, which is a great, great novel, right? It's a novel about race relations, and it's about violence and police brutality, right? The characters they don't exist in the real world, but the situations and the rules that they stick to, right? The rules of gravity, right? The world that's created is very much like our own, and it's arguably it is our own. All right, that's one example. The Godfather is another one, right? Corleone is Don Corleone, the main character, who is in the Italian mob. He is a fictional character. However, the same rules apply there as they do in the real world. If the main character, for example, just flew off at the end, right, had the ability to fly, that would seem really weird. It doesn't make sense within the world of that particular story. All right, so I think that makes sense, or somewhat some intuitive sense. So what happens when we read fiction enough? So I truly think that if we read fiction enough, it can change the way we think, right? It changes the way we experience the world. And it does that by letting us live in a world that is populated by what ifs. All right, if I just go through the world and my own experience, and I don't read fictional narratives, I don't think about the what ifs. All I'm focusing on is the day to day. I get up, I eat breakfast, I do work, I do X, Y, and Z, right? Whatever is in my day. So it's all about the everyday experience, right? Which is very much based in reality, right? Based in what I need to get done throughout my 24-hour period in order to be successful. All right? Now, if I read fiction, that gets me to think outside of that, to actually, even just for a moment, pop out of my own head, right? Leave this world that I am forced to inhabit and move into another one. Instead of living in this world, I can live in the world of Harry Potter, in the world of Lord of the Rings, right? And whatever world I am entering at that particular moment. All right, so we can use that to think about a bunch of different stories, right, and generate questions. So, what if there were a band of superheroes for when things got really bad, right? That's the premise of the Avengers. What if I, myself, were aboard the Titanic as it sank? What would that experience be like? What would it feel like? How could I enter that world? Right? So that gives us the movie Titanic, one of the highest grossing films of all time. What if, and this is one of my favorites, I somehow found a way to enter the world of spirits and I could interact with them. I could see them. I could talk to them. And they could hurt me, right? There's that kind of threat when you enter a world like that. This is the premise of Spirited Away, right? What if I found a way to enter that world and exist within that world? And this is one of my favorite animated movies, which is just delightful and is really kind of a tribute to the imagination. All right, so with that all out of the way, and I know that was probably a lot of information already, now we can get into the really heavy stuff. All right, fiction is based off of a paradox, and a paradox is simply a contradiction, something that seems counterintuitive, right? To go against reason and intuition. All right, so fiction is based off of this idea: to think more critically about the world around us, right? The one I'm always living in. We need to momentarily step out of that world, right? To step away from it and really, really take a look at it, right? So, and I think in some ways this makes sense. If we are walking down the street, right? All we're really focusing on is the world immediately around us, right? As this person in the GIF that I just played walks down the street, right? Down this crosswalk. He looks at what is immediately around him, right? He's not thinking about the big stuff, right? So if we were to swap that out, get rid of it, and put in its place a map instead, right? Now this is basically an aerial perspective. It gives us a sense of the overall view. So by looking at that map, we can actually understand this person's experience as he walks down the street of New York or any city. We can understand that experience better, right? By focusing not on what is immediately around us, by looking above, looking at a map, looking at an aerial view, we can understand the experience more, right? So that's the paradox of fiction, right? So we can use fiction, and people do use fiction to think about racism, to think about sexism, to think about the assumptions that we make about the world, right? And fictional stories give us a great deal of leeway for thinking about this, and I think that's extremely important. All right, so now, what are the real-life applications of this? I honestly think that reading fiction and studying fiction is one of the best ways for us to improve, to grow as individuals, and even as employees. And there are a couple ways that I think about this. So, empathy. Empathy is the ability to put yourself in someone else's shoes. All right, so in order to really empathize with an individual, what you are doing is you are trying to put yourself in their world. It's the exact same practice, the exact same thing as what we are doing when we enter a fictional universe. All right, innovation. The idea behind innovation in the workforce is that you think outside the box. Right, so we're doing the same thing as what we do when we step outside of the world to understand it. That's actually an innovative step, right? You step outside of the world, enter into another one, and then you think about your own. Innovation is the same thing, right? You look at the solutions that are typically used, you go outside of them, and then you reflect on the solutions that you have available to you. It's the exact same thought process. The last real thing I want us to think about in terms of fiction is that fiction is a way of thinking about social change, right? Fiction doesn't have to be closely tied to our own world. It can do something different, right? So it actually gives us a model for thinking about changes, thinking about how we can change the world around us. All right, so those are the main things I wanted to point out in terms of how fiction works. And I hope that this was helpful. Feel free to send me any questions as they pop up.